We have had some swirling rumours about this recently, but it does now seem to have been confirmed that the Black Templars Codex is going to be very, very different from not only the main Marine Codex, but also the other standalone chapters, the Blood Angels, the Space Wolves, and the Dark Angels, in that they now sport their very own unique army rule and forego the typical Oath of Moment rule that every other Loyalist chapter so far in this edition has had. So yes, no longer will you as a Black Templars player get the option to use Oath of Moment. You will no longer be able to pick an enemy unit in your command phase and get full rerolls to hit against it. Which seems like a pretty big loss, I'll grant you, but instead you get a brand new army rule. And what it is actually one of your old detachment rules, the Templar Vows. That is no longer a detachment rule, that detachment seems to be gone. Instead, those rules have become your army rule, and then what is coming with the new codex is 3 entirely brand new detachments for you to play around with. So this is actually really, really big news. It is huge for what was essentially the standard Space Marine army rule going away for a specific chapter. It could mean potentially that eventually the Space Wolves, the Blood Angels, and the Dark Angels will also be getting an update at some point this edition and readjusted army rules as well. Nothing is actually confirmed with that. Of course, it could just be the Black Templars, but this very well could be a sign of things to come in GW testing the waters to see how it works to have divergent army rules for the different Marine chapters. And I think that would be a really good thing. Certainly, it would mean a lot more variety and difference and decision making in terms of choosing which chapter you wanted to play, and more specifically, how you actually wanted to run the army. So it's a really interesting change, and I think it is generally a pretty good one. So the Templar Vows, this is now your army rule. It is actually quite different from the way it was in your detachment, but it does follow that same sort of idea, and that you pick a specific vow. Presumably this will be done at the start of the first battle round or at the start of the game, and then you get an associated buff for the rest of the battle. You do get the same choices as you had in the detachment. You get Abhor the Witch, accept any challenge no matter the odds, suffer not the unclean to live, and uphold the honor of the Emperor. And as I said, they each bring a unique and thematic and cool buff to your army, so you really can use this army rule to cater to the battle ahead and use the one that is going to get you the most for the situation that you find yourself in. So it is quite dynamic and flexible, but in terms of the actual buffs that you get from this rule, they are quite different to the ones that you may remember from the detachment, and I would say they are a little less overtly powerful. They are maybe a little more niche and tricky to kind of think about how to get the most out of them. They are certainly less fire and forget than the old detachment ones were, but I think they are a lot more fluffy and thematic, and they make a lot more sense for what the name of the vows are, in my opinion. So gone is the fairly simple options of things like sustained or lethal hits or a 6-up feel no pain. Instead, you get a rather nice melee buff with accept any challenge, which means if you are fighting a target and the target you're fighting in melee has a toughness equal to or higher than your strength, then you get +1 to wound them, basically meaning even things like your regular chainswords can now be wounding knights or titans or land raiders on a 5 rather than a 6, which is very, very good when you are fighting in melee anything from terminators to custodes to aforementioned land raiders. Suffer not the unclean to live loses the lethal hits in melee and instead gains you the ability to charge after falling back, which is fairly nice, and also some extra flexibility when you choose to make pile in or consolidate moves. It lets you end your move closer to a whole enemy unit rather than just the closest enemy model. So it's a bit tricky to kind of fully appreciate until you are using it on the battlefield, but it really will allow you to make some extra sneaky pile-in moves and consolidates to get into a better position, to maybe get nearer to an objective or into a better position where you can then potentially pile in a later game into another enemy unit. So it is actually quite a powerful buff. It's just one that you really need to get to grips with using to really get the most out of it. It's not, as I said, as simple or straightforward or fire and forget as something like lethal hits. Uphold the Honor of the Emperor drops the 6-up Feel No Pain, which again was a very straightforward, simple fire and forget one. Instead, this gains your infantry units sticky objectives, which is really, really strong, and it also gets you a second ability, which is that you can do actions on your units even if they've advanced. So this is going to just make you much, much better at that objective and secondary play, which is really important for winning you games. The specific vow that has actually stayed the most similar is Abhor the Witch. This is still your anti-psyker option, but it has changed in that instead of giving you a 4-up invulnerable save against psychic attacks and anti-psyker 4+ in melee, you now get to re-roll charges against psychic units, and you also have precision in melee against psychic units. So I would say this is better. Overall, you lose that extra bit of durability with the 4-up invuln and also the anti-psyker 4+ in melee, which is a shame, but getting those re-roll to charges is incredibly good and it can make you much more reliable at getting into combat. And then of course having precision means you can now much more easily target out and snipe out those enemy psykers and kill them in melee whilst they are in the middle of buffing up their units. So it is different. Some people might prefer the old invuln and anti-psyker 4+, but I think the reroll charges is a really good kind of extra rule for just making you more reliable, and then precision is a really good rule when you want to be just going in and killing those psykers as quickly as you can. As I said, they have changed quite substantially across the board, and they are definitely a lot less plug and play. They do require more thought to get the most out of them on the battlefield, but I think they are across the board as good, if not better, and personally I think they fit the names of the vow much better now. You know, uphold the honor of the Emperor, giving you better objective scoring, which makes sense. Suffer not the unclean, lets you get near to another enemy unit or objective that may be your primary target. Accept any challenge gives you that huge boost against those tougher, scarier enemies and monsters and that sort of thing. It is just a lot more thematic and fun, I think, and it does seem, in my opinion, to be a very good, strong army rule for the Templars to play around with. We do also see another new rule for the Templars, which you would expect. The Heirs of Sigismund rule is the sort of restrictions that you have when you bring Black Templars. And of course, they do have quite a lot of things that they can't bring, or specific things that they can't use in terms of how you build and play a Black Templars army. So of course, you can't bring any Psykers, that makes sense. You also can't use the First Company Task Force detachment, which is quite interesting. The rest of the detachments from the main Marine Codex do still seem to be fair game for now anyway, but certainly you can't use the First Company Task Force. Otherwise, there are a few restrictions in things like the Gladiator tanks, the Impulsors, and the Land Raider Crusader, because Black Templars get their own version of those with a multi-melter. What is quite interesting is that you also can't use Sternguard veterans, but they do say that they will get their own Black Templars version, so maybe there will be a unique datasheet called Black Templar Sternguard Veteran with their own unique rules and mechanics, which means you can't bring the main Codex one, which I think is actually really good, and I hope they do that, even if they don't completely change the army rule, just bring some more unique individual units from the main Codex to the other armies to allow them to kind of really tailor them for a specific faction without making them underpowered or overpowered, like having Blood Angels have their own version of Vanguard Veterans or Assault Intercessors or something like that, or Dark Angels having their own version of Hellblasters or something, just to make them a bit more unique and interesting for that specific faction to bring. Again, there's nothing hugely surprising in this rule, but I do think it's interesting to see how GW are slowly trickling in these limitations and restrictions and changes as I think a bit of a testbed to see how people like it, so that they can potentially use it as a precursor to some similar or even bigger changes to armies like the Dark Angels or the Blood Angels or the Space Wolves. They also cover in the article today the 3 new detachments that you will get access to. There is the Vindication Task Force, the Companions of Vehemence, and the Godhammer Assault Force. Now, the Vindication Task Force is the only one we actually see the rules for. That brings the rule Purge and Sanctify. And what that means is that whenever an ancient unit in your army is targeted and is within range of an objective, if the strength of the enemy attack is higher than your toughness, that unit is -1 to be wounded. So this brings you a lot of incentive to bring those fancy new Black Templars Ancients that we got shown off a few weeks ago, and it is going to make your units very, very, very durable as they are holding an objective from the enemy. But that's not all the detachment brings, it also brings a buff for your Crusader squads, whose Righteous Zeal rule now allows them to end their move with that rule closer to the nearest objective rather than the closest enemy unit. Now this seems to be a big change because currently the Righteous Zeal rule allows the unit to reroll advance and charge rolls. It does seem from the wording that that is going to change. I imagine in the new book it will be a way to make some kind of reactive move. If you've been targeted by the enemy or shot or something like that, you will be able to make a d6-inch move or something like that. And usually, I imagine it will specify you have to move towards the enemy unit that shot you or the closest enemy unit. But with this detachment, it seems you can use that to move potentially onto a nearby objective to help you score better. We also got to see an enhancement and a stratagem for the detachment. Consecrating Aura gives the bearer and his unit a 5-up invulnerable save, which is really, really good. You know, putting this onto an ancient can make a unit that could have potentially 40 wounds if you bring 20 Crusaders with a 5-up invulnerable save and -1 to incoming wound rolls if they are sat on an objective. So you can, with this detachment and that enhancement, bring an impossibly tanky brick to just try and shift for your opponent that can just be scoring you points and raining down fire into the enemy all game long. And then the stratagem we got shown is Refusal to Yield. This also brings some more durability, but for the Ancient himself this time. In any phase after an Ancient model is destroyed, for 1 command point, you can essentially bring them back onto the battlefield with their full wounds remaining. So if your Ancient gets precisioned out or just gets killed off after the rest of your squad has been destroyed, they can come back with full wounds to keep inspiring your forces and just bringing judgment to the enemy. So it's a pretty good stratagem for just 1 command point. Getting a full Ancient model back at full health is quite a useful thing to bring, especially for that relatively cheap 1 command point. And then whilst we don't actually see the rules for the other 2 detachments, we are told about them. We get told that the Companions of Vehemence gives your units reroll advance and charge rolls, basically the old Righteous Zeal rule from your Crusaders, which for a melee focused army is incredibly good. It can bring you a load of much needed reliability in getting into combat with your charges, and especially if there is an enhancement or a stratagem to let you advance and charge, that will get you around the board incredibly fast and incredibly reliably into combats you need to be in. And then the last detachment that's going to be in the Codex is the Godhammer Assault Force. This one focuses on vehicles and your armoured transports and that sort of thing. The detachment seems to bring some buffs for units that have disembarked on a particular turn, so possibly maybe letting your units charge even after they've disembarked from things like a Rhino rather than just Land Raiders, or maybe giving you some kind of rerolls to hit or wound or both when they've disembarked from a transport, which could be incredibly good if you've got, say, a unit of Terminators or Sword Brethren that have disembarked from a Land Raider and can just charge in, getting those rerolls or +1 to hit or +1 to wound or whatever it may be. Any buffs on units that can get out of a transport and then charge into the enemy can make them absolutely terrifying for your opponent because of that extra threat range that they have. So I'm pretty hyped for this. I think the new army rule is a really great choice for GW and hopefully a direction that they take the other non-main codex chapters like the Space Wolves and the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels. I really do hope they lean into that a bit more. The detachments all seem to be pretty good as well. You've got a fairly sort of generic one. You've got one that is just going to be really good for your infantry advancing up and charging in. And then you've got the one for your more vehicle focused, loads of Land Raiders and that sort of thing and stuff, just moving up and then disembarking and charging in. So a lot to play around with and some fairly fun, thematic and fluffy rules for the faction as well. As always though, I'd really love to know what you think of the Black Templars and what you think of these new rules and how you think it's going to make the Black Templars compared to some of the other Marine factions in the game at the moment. Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.